The Age of Industrialization. In this chapter, we will learn before the Industrial Revolution, hand labor, industrial growth in India, factories coming up, the peculiarities of industrial growth, and markets for goods. Before the Industrial Revolution, proto-industrialization was the early phase of industrialization in which large-scale production was carried out for international market, not at factories but in decentralized production units. The main features of proto-industrial system. It was decentralized system of production. Merchants lived in towns, but the work was mostly done in the countryside. This system of production was controlled by the merchants, and the goods were produced by a large number of producers working within their family farms. Under this system, the work was done by involving the whole family. The workers remained in the countryside and continued to cultivate their small plots of land. The coming up of the factory. By 1730s, factories came up in England. Cotton was the first symbol of the new era, and Richard Arkwright created the cotton mill. The efficacy was increased with the series of inventions in the production process, that is, of carding, twisting, spinning, and rolling. The pace of industrial change. Cotton and metals were the most dynamic industries in Britain, later on replaced by iron and steel. By 1873, the export of iron and steel was double than the cotton export in Britain with the starting of the railways. It was not easy to displace traditional industries. By the new industries, domestic units were producing large portion of the output in comparison to the factories. For non-mechanized sectors such as the food processing, building, pottery, glasswork, etc., ordinary and small innovations were the basis of growth. Technological change was slow because it was expensive, and its use had made the merchants and industrialists little cautious. Breakdown and repairing was very costly. Hand labor. There was no shortage of human labor in Victorian Britain, and the industrialists had no labor problem because poor peasants and vagrants moved in large numbers in search of jobs to the cities. The demand for work was seasonal. Therefore, industrialists usually preferred hand labor who could be employed seasonally. Works like breweries, bookbinding and printing, catering to Christmas demand, etc., were seasonal work and needed more workers to meet the demand. Thus, they were employing workers for the season. Life of the workers. More workers, less jobs. There was no shortage of workers in the market as compared to demand. As a result, workers were ready to work at very low wages. People were always on the move in search of work. Seasonality of work. Due to seasonality of work in many industries like gas works, breweries, printing, book binding, etc., there were prolonged periods without work. The rest of the time was spent on the streets due to intense poverty. Low real wages. Wages increased somewhat in the early 19th century, but the increase was nullified and neutralized by increase in prices. Unemployment, poverty and misery. Till the middle 19th century, about 10% of the urban population was extremely poor. The proportion of unemployment went up to everything between 35 and 75% in different regions, making the life of the poor still more miserable. The spinning jenny. Before you is a picture of the spinning jenny. The spinning process was speeded up with the help of the spinning jenny, and it also reduced the labor demand. It was devised by James Hargreaves in 1764, and when it was introduced in the woolen industry, the women started attacking the new machine because it was taking away their work. Industrial growth in India. The age of Indian textiles. The international market in textiles was dominated by silk and cotton goods from India. Goods from Punjab were taken by Armenian and Persian merchants to Afghanistan, Eastern Persia and Central Asia. The Gulf and Red Sea ports were connected to the Gujarat coast in India by Surat and Hooghly in Bengal, had trade links with Southeast Asian ports. But this network started breaking down from 1750s and the European countries gained power. Bombay and Calcutta came up as new trade ports, replacing Surat and Hooghly, indicating the growth of colonial power, but European companies controlled the trade of the new ports. The life of Indian weavers. Under the company rules, the weavers suffered a lot. The company appointed paid servants called gumastas to supervise the weavers and collect supplies. They acted arrogantly and punished weavers for delay in supplies. Because of this, there were often clashes between the weavers and the gumastas. The company often gave advance or loan to the weavers at the time of placing the order. This bounded the weavers to the company. The weavers had to sell the goods to the company at a dictated price. The weavers were prohibited from contacting other traders or selling their goods to others. Manchester comes to India. With the development of cotton industries, the industrial groups in England started worrying about imports from other countries. To sell the goods in Britain without facing any competition from outside, the industrialists pressurized the government to impose import duties on cotton textiles. At the same time, the East India Company was also persuaded to sell British manufactures in Indian markets by the industrialists, due to which cotton weavers in India faced problems. Problems of the Indian cotton weavers in the 19th century. Their export market collapsed. The local market shrank, being glutted with Manchester imports. The Manchester cotton was so cheap that the Indian textiles could not compete with them. By the 1850s, weavers faced another problem of not getting sufficient supply of raw material of good quality. This happened because the Civil War had broken out in America. By the end of the 19th century, weavers and craft persons faced another problem. Factories in India began production and the market began to be flooded with machine goods. Now we will discuss about the factories that came up. The first cotton mill, Bombay, in the year 1854. The first cotton mill in Bombay came up in the year 1854 and it went into production 2 years later. Second, 4 mills came up in 1862. By 1862, 4 mills were at work with 94,000 spindles and 2,150 looms. The first jute mill came up in Bengal in the year 1855. The first jute mill was set up in 1855 in Bengal, and another mill came up 7 years later in 1862. Then the Elgin mill came up in Kanpur. In the north, the Elgin mill was started in Kanpur in 1860, and a year later, the first cotton mill was set up at Ahmedabad. The first spinning mill and weaving mill came up in 1874. So by 1874, the first spinning mill and weaving mill of Madras began production. The early entrepreneurs. The history of business groups goes back to trade with China. The British in India began exporting opium to China and took tea from China to England. The Indian business groups became junior players in the trade, providing finance, procuring supplies, and shipping consignments. They made huge profits through this trade. Some of these businessmen had a vision of developing industrial enterprises in India. In Bengal, Dwarkanath Tagore set up 6 joint stock companies in the 1830s and 1840s. In Bombay, Parsis like Dinshaw Patit and Jamshedji Nusarwanji Tata built huge industrial empires in India. Seth Hukamchand set up the first jute mill in Calcutta in the year 1917. The peculiarities of industrial growth. A series of changes affected the patterns of industrialization in India by the first decade of the 20th century. People started boycotting foreign goods as soon as the Swadeshi movement gained momentum. At the same time, the government was pressurized by the industrial groups to protect their collective interests by increasing tariff and grant other concessions. The Chinese market was flooded with the products from the Chinese and Japanese mills, which ultimately declined the export of Indian yarn to China from 1906. With the start of the First World War, British mills got engaged in supplying goods to the army. Thus, Manchester imports into India declined. This gave a golden opportunity to the Indian industries to boom. After the war was over, British industries got a setback. The economy of Britain crumbled after the war. In India, however, the local industrialists gradually consolidated their position and gained success in capturing the home market. Increase in handloom production between 1900 and 1940. Fly shuttles were used in the looms by the weavers from the second decade of the 20th century, increasing productivities per worker, speeding up production and reducing labor demand. In the regions like Travancore, Madras, Mysore, Cochin and Bengal, over 35% of the handlooms were fitted with the fly shuttles in 1941. Both finer varieties and coarse cloth were produced by the weavers. The demand for the finer varieties was more among the rich classes. The sale of Banarsi or Baluchari saris was not affected by the famines. Weavers lived hard lives and worked long hours. They could not prosper in spite of the expanded production throughout the 20th century. Market for goods. Advertisements. The producers used advertisements to create consumers and made products appear desirable and necessary. Advertisements appeared in newspapers, magazines, street walls, and television screens. Labeling. Labels were put on cloth bundles by Manchester industrialists before selling the cloth. The buyers felt confident in buying the cloth on which "Made in Manchester" was written. Calendars. By the late 19th century, manufacturers were printing calendars to popularize their products. In these calendars, we see the figure of gods. Then, images of important personages. Besides the images of God, figures of important personages of emperors and nawabs adorned advertisements and calendars. Then we go on to advertisements by Indian manufacturers. The nationalist message was clear and loud with the advertisements of the Indian manufacturers. These advertisements acted as a vehicle of the nationalist message of